Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
and me, Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
We're here at BookFest Windsor with Mark Bourrie, a historian, journalist, and lawyer. His latest book, Bushrunner, The Adventures of Pierre-Esprit Radisson, was a national bestseller. He's also the author of The Fog War, Censorship of Canada's Media in World War II, Kill the Messengers, Stephen Harper's Assault on Your Right to Know, and The Killing Game, Martyrdom, Murder, and the Lure of ISIS. Ooh, that's a title.
Nasty. Lots of killing in my book. So running, I think now we're finally having people escape from being killed. So this is nice.
Well, excellent. So what drew you to this story? What was the inspiration for this particular book?
This project is like 15 years old, and I had looked him up for something. I'd done a PhD in history when I was in my 40s, and for some reason I looked him up, and I thought, well, like we always hear that he was French and that he defected to the English when they started the Hudson Bay Company. Like that's what everybody knows about the guy. And as I read through whatever it was, probably an encyclopedia entry, I came across all these places where he'd been. And so I see he's with the Mohawk, he's in New France, he's in New Netherlands, he's in New York City when it's 2,000 people. He spent several months there. He's in Holland, in France. He's in England during the Great Plague and the Great Fire, and on this expedition to the Caribbean that's totally wiped out when a whole fleet sails into coral reefs. And I thought, like, this person saw so many cool things, and you can tell the story of this whole world through this man's eyes. And I wrote it on an outline, and I collected everything I could, and I, basically salted it away because nobody seemed to know what to do with the story. I offered it around to publishers. They said, nobody reads Canadian biography, nobody reads Canadian history. Well, that's not true. We sold an awful lot of these books. And everybody saw him the way they'd been taught. And I said, no, let's look at him the way human beings really are. And my very advanced age and my own experience dealing with all kinds of people. At one point, I interviewed almost every serial killer in the country. And, I worked on Parliament Hill for 25 years knew all the politicians, the ministers, the prime ministers. Actually, there's not an awful lot of difference between a politician and a serial killer, but we'll go to that some other time. Okay. And I said, and I thought, well, let's talk about him as a person instead of these images that we have of the historical people, because when we think of history, our mind almost goes into comic book mode. Mm-hmm. And we think of the paintings, and we think of these people not being like us and not having desires and needs and ambitions, and we think of them as pretty much always being somewhat honest or whatever, having a kind of morality that doesn't exist. And with Radisson, I thought, well, no, I know that these people that he's with in England, like when he meets Prince Rupert, Prince Rupert was this prince. Well, Prince Rupert was a pirate. Prince Rupert spent 10 years in exile during the English Civil War, mostly working as a pirate, and his brother Maurice was washed off a pirate ship and drowned. And was a totally ruthless, vicious human being. He was so ruthless that as a 23-year-old general in the English Civil War, the parliamentary soldiers were trying to shoot his dogs on the battlefields of the Civil War because they thought that he was a witch and that these were his familiars. Like witches have familiars. Like this is how badass Rupert was, and this was a time when. That was very, very tough. It was a time of world war over religion. It was really at the beginning of capitalism. And you didn't do the things that Rupert did or the things that Radisson did unless you just had no fear. And I thought that's pretty cool too. And I wanted to talk about a world that was very similar to ours, but also very different. And then when it got as I got into actually writing the book, and so this is many years later, Dan Wells and Janice Warbney, who edited the book, basically say, "You want to write this book?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll write this book." I'd been wanting to anyway, and I started researching the Indigenous people, and I'd done that anyway as a law student. I'd written my major paper in law school on Indigenous property rights. Nobody does property law in law school. I love property law, and I had written this academic paper that was basically a rebuttal of what Conrad Black had said about Indigenous people not being First Nations. What is a First Nation? And I said, okay, First Nations have laws. First Nations have foreign policies. First Nations have respect for property and protection of property. And I talked about land rights and personal property and intellectual property. A canoe route that you discovered was yours. And that's intellectual property. So I thought, well, this is a great way to rebut that in sort of the popular press. Explain to people that that there was not the naivety and the sort of, and I guess for lack of a better word, they were sophisticated people with a whole set of their own sort of plans and desires and strategies and things, trying to cope in this weird world that was happening around them, and sometimes succeeding and sometimes not. And Radisson is not a leader. He's not coming in there and changing things. He's our eyes into all that.
Wow. What a fascinating journey to get to the story. So would you characterize it as sort of a hero story or a cautionary tale? Or, I mean, does it have any kind of a flavor like that? Or it's just you're trying to be as authentic as possible?
The story Radisson itself has no moral.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
He is like that friend of yours that you think, I'm not really sure I should be friends with this person, but I really want to see where the story goes with them. The friend has been through like 6, spouses, and that like they might just run under the rocks, or they're going to become like prime minister or president or something. It's that kind of person, and so like the kind of person that you would love to have around, but you would never like leave your kids with.
He's almost an unreliable
so in that way, like there's no great moral to his life, except it's an exercise in what ambition looks like. But where the sort of message is about, I'm saying in the book, let's take a look at what we think of as explorers. That basically most of these explorers were passengers of people who are already doing things, who lived here. And let's take a look at where we see ourselves coming from and what the world was like back in the time when this contact, really the most powerful part of early contact between First Nations people and Europeans, is happening. So they're trying to deal with the plagues. They're trying to deal with the new weapons. There's some groups that are so powerful that they can just blast away everybody else. And the survivors have to cope. And Radisson sees all of this stuff. So we get to see this world that's not the world that Hollywood talks about, Indigenous people. And then we see a Europe that's very different from what we think of, for people like me of European ancestry. I thought of Europe as more peaceful, and people just come over here because they want a better life and the whole sort of American dream stuff. And you realize that what's going on in Europe is just sending all kinds of refugees into the world. Just like what's going on in North America is sending Indigenous refugees flying out from the southern Great Lakes to the north and stuff. And it's not an apology. It's not a lesson of guilt, though there's a certain amount of guilt there. It's just what happened. I think a historian has to just, in a lot of ways, tell people straight up, like, this is what happened. And I see it this way, but you may see it another way. A lot of things just happen by accident. You turn left when you should have turned right, and you walked into something. And this is what happens to Radisson from the very first pages of the book. He should have gone back to the town he was staying in when he's 14, but he gets greedy hunting ducks. And if he hadn't got greedy hunting ducks, all the rest of what happened in his whole life would never have happened. And, I met my wife when I was folding laundry on a dining room table because she knew this guy who was her friend from BC, and she was going to university 100 miles away, and her mother had come, and her mother had left a car, and on that weekend she had the car, and she went to see her friend, and her friend came to my place, and she met me folding laundry. And, there are so many zigs and zags in that story where I could have been out. I could have been, my friend could have taken her out for dinner. Her mother might not have come with the car, or might not have wanted to give her the car. Like, there's a million things, and that's like each of our lives work that way, and then everybody around us is having the same sort of life, right? And that's the way I write history, and I'd say, well, there's nothing preordained. There's nothing that I don't believe in. Dialectical materialism. I don't believe that everything is about money. Sometimes people just go for a walk, just to go for a walk, and that's the story of his life. Is a million things that sometimes it seems bad. He gets caught by pirates, bad. He gets dumped in Spain, not so good. Not a good place for a Frenchman that's got no money. But it takes him so long to get to England that he misses a big plague outbreak. That's good. And then there's a big fire in London. Well, that's bad. And they're hanging Frenchmen literally all over the place. Any Frenchman they can get, because English have always been rather xenophobic. Just like, we're in Brexit today. Well, but he's a friend of the king, so he's safe. And like this on and on, where this switch goes off and this switch goes on, and it's and that all adds up to a life, right? The time that it snows and the road's closed and where you're supposed to go to something, and then when you find out that something bad happened there anyway, or somebody that you really didn't want to see didn't show up, and you're like relieved. And this is his life. It's the life of the next person I'm writing about, and very few of our strategies work out.
That is so true.
If you think about what you thought your life would be, and hopefully you'll say, well, yeah, it's not what I thought it would be, but it still was really cool. I hope for that for everybody. I had no idea my life would be what my life is. I thought when I was a teenager, well, most of us, back then, or a little kid, I was going to be a fireman or whatever. I thought I would be a history professor, and that didn't happen because I went to university and I didn't have any friends. And so I thought I'd go write for the college paper, and fell in with a bunch of reprobates, and spent 35 years in journalism after that. And then I got a PhD because I thought, well, I've always wanted one. And I met a 100-year-old man who was I was writing a newspaper article about how he was still a newspaper columnist for a French newspaper in Quebec. And he said, I was the last press censor. Why do we have press censors? He says, yeah, I was the guy. I put everything in boxes, and this is in the 1990s. He says, 50 years is up. He said, I never thought I would live that long. And I said, yeah. And he said, there's all kinds of good stuff in there. It's all in the archives. I said, I packed it myself. There's all kinds of great stories. So then I said, wow. I thought, that would be my PhD. And then one of my best friends knew the professor who'd done the first World War censorship system. So 6 weeks later, I'm offered a full scholarship, TA-ship, basically a free ride through with this PhD handed to me by this 100-year-old man.
So it sounds like you feel some connection with Radisson.
Yeah. I think everybody should in some ways. I'm not a cannibal, and I don't expect I ever will be. But Tory times are hard times, and when there's an election coming, I think everybody should feel like anybody who's had any kind of life that's anywhere interesting, or I think everybody's life is interesting, should think about him and how all those zigs and zags work to make a life, and how sometimes the switch is on and you sort of get ahead, and then the switch is off. In his case, he picks the wrong side politically. Other people they have a divorce, or whatever. It's just life, and we all like to pry into other people's lives. My life isn't interesting enough to write a memoir. All the dysfunctions of my life have been pretty much covered by other writers. But I think it's one of the reasons why everybody likes, or many people like memoir writers. One of the big sort of stars of this thing is a memoir writer. Is because we love to peer into other people's lives and see when the switch went on and when the switch went off, and and we're not always looking for the positive either, if you know what I mean. Like if the person spirals down and they don't spiral down enough, that's kind of disappointing, before they claw their way back up, right? Or if they're persecuted, well, it's best to be really persecuted, not just like, I was the fat kid who didn't get picked in gym that much or whatever, which I wasn't, by the way. I was the skinny kid, but who didn't get picked in gym. But you know what I mean? It's everybody loves a good story, and this is I liked writing a good story. I was a newspaper person. I didn't like to write boring stories. I had to do it sometimes, and I didn't think Radisson was boring. And I thought, as I did the book, when's this guy's life going to get boring? Like, when's he going to kind of get old, or when's he going to stop? And as I went through the whole thing, he doesn't stop. And I was really glad. I thought, well, because some people have really interesting lives when they're young, and then they just don't, whatever. Or, they have kind of boring lives when they're young, and then things start to happen. External things, like maybe they're in a war or something. Maybe they have an exciting life like my in-laws, who were in Europe during the war, and then they don't want to have an exciting life anymore. They've seen enough excitement for one life. And they have really kind of conventional lives after that, though they can't help but have the odd thing come up. But not with him. It starts when he's a kid, from this sort of mist of his childhood, and right up until he dies. He's always kind of going. And then his kids have this weird stuff like happen to them too, like as much as I could find out about his children, because one of them's sentenced to hang, and another one is a murdered prostitute, and like it just does until they're all wiped out. Like as far as I know, there are no living Radisson descendants in Europe, but there are a lot in the Upper Great Lakes, if you catch my drift.
Okay.
No, actually, there's quite a good book on the Three Fires, and I'm going to put my historian's hat on and get my tongue out of my cheek, where the author talks about the start of the 7 Years' War, which is the war where Canada was surrendered from the French to the English. And a guy named Longlad is accused by this writer, quite convincingly, this is a piece of scholarship, not just some crank, of starting the 7 Years' War, because he's up in the Upper Lakes, and he's a leader of sort of the mixed blood people, and he attacks what we would say an American post in southern Michigan. And this spirals into violence that spreads to the East Coast and stuff. And so he basically fires the first shot of the 7 Years' War, and he's a descendant of Pierre Radisson. He traces his family, this mixed blood family, back through Pierre Radisson. So, and there's many, many other people who are descended through Indigenous people and mixed race people, and people who become French Canadian just because they're sort of Indigenous. And I'm not going to walk into very thin ice, but who's Indigenous is not really part of their identity anymore, and they are like the Radisson descendants are here, like in Windsor, in Penetanguishene. Because what happened was that most of the people who were mixed race, who lived around Mackinac, followed the Brits after the War of 1812, and some of them came down here, and some of them went to Penetanguishene and formed this mixed race community, which is mostly sort of self-identified as French, and that's so. So there were probably Radisson descendants in the crowd today. And if we were in Quebec, there would certainly be Groseilliers descendants, because he left a big family, and Quebec, had this tremendous birth rate where you have, 20 kids, 15 kids, and then generation after generation after generation. So that there were 5,000 people who came off the boats from France in the entire time of colonization of New France. Quite a few of those people went back. So of the remainder of the 5,000, there are about 8 million descendants. So you can see that everybody's... So I'm sure I'm some sort of half-assed relation to Groseilliers and possibly to Radisson. But there are people who can look at a family tree and go right to Groseilliers. And I've talked to them. The deputy mayor of Penetanguishene is one of them. So.
Wow. So what was different about the way you approached this project from some of your other historical books?
Well, the book on press censorship in the Second World War was very episodic, so I looked at different aspects of press censorship. So I looked at how they censored the naval war and the submarine attacks in the St. Lawrence River, and I looked at how they censored the Japanese balloon bombs that came off the Pacific into the Pacific Northwest in the States and into Canada. So each one of those chapters was basically a standalone kind of thing. And other books I'd written, I'd written a book, actually two books that were collections of Great Lakes shipwreck stories. So each one of those could stand alone. I wrote those books with the idea that you could read them at a cottage. And you could sit down for like 20 minutes and read a chapter. And if you wanted to like go for a swim or something, you just finish up the chapter and put the book down. But Radisson, it was the first biography that I had written of one person going from like their whole life. And I had written about ISIS propaganda and in a sort of academic way. I had written about Stephen Harper. That was definitely not a biography. The information control stuff and the tightening of control of sort of that was a very political Ottawa book of centralization of power in the Prime Minister's office, which I said no Prime Minister will ever let go of, which of course they didn't, much to the chagrin of. I'm talking a couple of days before the election, and I don't think it's going to go well for the Liberals. I may be wrong, but I think that there was a lot that could have been learned by Justin Trudeau and his team about how to do things right, and they didn't learn it. And if they get punished for that to the point where they lose, I won't be that happy. If they realize what they did and fix it, I will be extremely happy. I'm not thrilled by the way our government is run, says the guy whose wife works for the federal government. But in all seriousness, it's very hard to get information from the government. It's very hard for the press to do its work, and the press itself is in such a mess. The press is barely surviving in Ottawa now. It's so tainted. It has made so many mistakes in its own. And if I was to write a follow-up book, I would talk about the press's self-immolation, like the CBC suing the Conservatives during an election campaign. To me, it was probably the most stupid political move since the Second World War. We have press that they're getting bailed out by the same government they're covering. That's a big problem. If that ever happened in the States, people would go bananas. And yet here it's like, well, they aren't doing very well. Well, now they're not, for sure. And so that book was sort of a cautionary tale that unfortunately came true. But it was, Stephen Harper lost, and yet a lot of the things that are problematic about Ottawa are still problematic. So, getting back to Bushrunner, when I was looking at, was I going to write another book? And when they offered me this, I was like, I can say a lot about what I want to say about how things are, especially with Indigenous people, which I'd never written about. And I can also just get away from this rotten political media sphere. And so I wrote this book mostly in a little law office in a small town in the Ottawa Valley. And it was, I think the escapism that I felt as a writer writing the book comes through in the book. And so to me, it was a little vacation, and yet it was fun. And there's an awful lot of tongue-in-cheek stuff in the book. It's not, and then Radisson, blah, blah, blah. I got to tell the story. I got to move it along. And there are several people on the, Amazon site I would like to throttle because, I can't understand this. It's not the Radisson girl story I read about. Well, no, it's not. You go read that again. But I got to tell the story and have a lot of fun with it. And I think I did a lot of good for some people, not necessarily Radisson. And I think I might, this is going to be very, I don't know. I have changed the way I write history, and I think I might change the way some other people write history. There are not a lot of people writing history for people in this country to read. And academics aren't writing for people to read. They're writing for other academics. There are not commercial historians anymore that are writing sort of commercial stuff like, Pierre Burton or Peter Newman. The only one I can think of is Charlotte Gray, who writes for people to read. And I want to be one of those people who writes for people to read because I don't want that to be lost. I don't want people to get their history from Wikipedia, and for academics to think that the people who pay them, which is us, not just the kids who pay tuition, but we all pay for academia, that they can have their hobbies and their sort of little closed world. I don't want that to be the only way history is written. And I want history to be fair. And I try to be fair. And I'm sure that people will say that I lean this way or that way. But in my mind, I'm fair until I'm convinced otherwise. I really don't go through that book and say, geez, I was too hard on the Indigenous people, or I was too easy. There was somebody who was stalking me online who wrote anywhere they could that that this is a politically correct book, and you can see the air quotes in the air as you listen to this, and that I lied and said that the Indigenous people were well off, and that they had fabulous things, and that nobody starved, and so I know the person never got past page 60 because one of the key parts of the early part of the book is a horrible famine where Radisson damn near starves to death. So I know this person didn't read very far, and I'm thinking this is really mean and horrible, and that's so. What do you do?
It sounds like you bumped up against somebody's belief system there or whatever. Yeah, something they didn't want to let go of.
Well, yeah, a lot of people don't want to let go of it, and they use history to, or they have these prejudices that they don't want to let go of, and or they, I don't know, yeah. Sorry, I'm at a loss for words because I don't understand why people aren't willing to learn through their lives. Because this is one of the things in my own life is I really am really thirsty to learn all the time, and I don't ever consider myself educated, and so I'll get sort of immodest, but I have a PhD and I have a law degree, and all I ever learned from those two things is I don't know dick about anything. I don't know any law hardly. I know some history. I know more history than most people. So I know more history than maybe 90% of people, but I don't know any history either. But what I did learn was where to find stuff. So the first person I made friends with when I went to law school was the librarian. And, we, and I feed that all the time. And so when someone says, I'm not going to go past my prejudices, I'm not going to let you tell me about these people. And not only am I not going to let you tell me, I'm going to try and hex you so that nobody else reads this either. And then, of course, my censorship ears come up from the years in the media and the years of writing about censorship and saying, why are you trying to stifle me? And I don't try to stifle people. There's lots of people who are really extreme on all sides of the issue of Indigenous history and Indigenous rights, and what is owed by non-Indigenous people, and what Indigenous people are in terms of, are they nations, are they groups of people, are they just a minority or whatever, right? And I know people who are Indigenous scholars who believe things that I don't think I would ever believe. And I think a lot of that's based on anger. And I also see people who are completely the other side, who write horrible things about how Indigenous people should just assimilate because, they're a conquered culture. And I don't agree with those either. But I am very loath to censor. I have one hand down for the evil, they should assimilate, and one hand down for the scholars who say that basically they had a perfect society, and European people just came and ruined this utopia. And I don't believe that the right hand should be censored, and I don't believe the left hand should be censored. That where we are, where we really work as a society, in North American society, why the great American experiment works so well, is that in the discussion itself, people grow and they learn. And sometimes they lean one way and sometimes they lean the other. But Harry Truman, there's that wonderful book by Merle Miller where he interviews Harry Truman. And it's like a back and forth. And Harry Truman, I think, really had it nailed where he said, sometimes the American people swing one way, sometimes the American people swing the other, but they always come back to a solid place in the middle. And I think that's the same in Canada too. I think we're not really that much different from Americans in terms of that kind of culture. So let people talk about it. Let me explain it my way. Somebody else wants to write a Radisson book saying that he was a great guy and he was the best thing that ever happened to whatever. That the Hudson Bay fur trade was this great thing for. Go for it. Put it out, and see if people buy it. And I use that word two ways, I suppose. Buy it like off a shelf, like the Radisson book has sold very well. So people, obviously, it wasn't like text, and see if people believe, because otherwise, we just we'll have Soviet scholarship. We'll have someone
Thought
tell us what to believe. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you think part of what you were doing in the book is maybe kind of humanizing him again?
Oh yeah, definitely. I did a session here, and I talked about how when we think of the image of the explorer from our grade school textbooks and high school textbooks, and from mural, I live in Ottawa, and there's murals of Indigenous people, and there was a statue of Champlain on a hill with Indigenous people around him, and there's a statue on Parliament Hill for the War of 1812, and in every one of them, the Indigenous people are always bent over. They're always a head lower than everybody else. And then there's this, if you were to look in a book, if you look up Radisson, Google Radisson, you do it right now, you'll see pictures of a guy standing in a canoe while a bunch of Native people paddle, and he's the explorer, right? And he's like a superior being. Well, of course, I totally reject that right off the bat. And what I did, I talked about this in the session, is I make Radisson sit down in the canoe, and he has to paddle, and he's freight just like and he's not running this thing, and he never did. I think in that book it really shows that he's always along for somebody else's ride, and that was the way the continent was opened up in a lot of ways, until there was sort of a critical mass of European people who began to change the environment, plow the prairies and deforest the East Coast and build cities and build railways and things. But up until that point, when anybody, air quote again, explored anything, they really just basically were there through the sufferance of the Indigenous people. And the cool thing about Radisson, the thing that makes him so different from everybody in the 1600s whose work I read, was that he really liked the Indigenous people, and he really liked this part of the world. He didn't actually get to Windsor, unfortunately, but he got to Toledo, and he liked that.
That's pretty close.
It's pretty close. He liked Upper Michigan. He never said, "Oh, this is an ugly country. This is bitching about how." He didn't complain, and he liked the people. And when he was adopted by the Mohawk when he was 14, and when he left, he took off for reasons that are in the book, and they were not that bad, his reasons. But he runs into Mohawk again 5 years later, and he's asking about his family, and he's giving the Mohawk stuff to take back to the adopted people who he loved so much, and the only people he ever talked about loving in all the stuff he ever wrote. And he's married 4 times, and I think he loved his first wife quite a bit, because he actually does stuff to try to be with her. They're separated by events, and her father's this wealthy ex-pirate, and Radisson's basically run out of friends in England, and he has to go to France, and he wants her to come with him, and her father won't let her. She's got this really good allowance, and she's afraid of being poor in France. And Radisson goes back, and he pawns things to try and stay with her and everything until he runs out of money, and then he goes on this expedition that gets wiped out in the Caribbean. So I think he really did care about her, but the rest of them, we don't even know like much about them. And children like Radisson and Groseilliers, I mean, talk about, they're poster boys for deadbeat dads. Like Groseilliers, he comes home every time comes home to his wife lives in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. That's the other side of Montreal from. And every time Groseilliers comes home, he gets his wife pregnant and he leaves. So he's got all these kids, and there's no sign that he supports them. She's running a little store in this trading post that's almost always under siege by like hostile indigenous people. Yeah, he comes back, she have another kid, he leaves, and then he's gone for like 8 years at one point, and then he comes back and he just moves in. He's home now. And
Okay.
and that's the one whose parenting skills we know about. With Radisson, there's nothing about kids. He's gone all the time. There's except like we know that the ones that survived came to a bad end in horrible like ways, or like but we don't even know how many kids he had or anything like that. So yeah, these guys were really textbook deadbeat dads at a time when women, and there's not, I think the big flaw in the book is there's very little about women in the book, but there's very little on the record. And I didn't want to sort of make stuff up, but it's clear, and I do talk about it in the book, that there are always women carrying the ball for these guys, whether indigenous women doing like physical work and running the fur trade, or saving Radisson's life. Umpteen times his life is saved by indigenous women. And then there's these wives and stuff who are never treated very well through the book. And then he has finally one last wife who outlives him and sort of keeps him as an old man. And he's at that point he's kind of leaning towards broke, not quite broke. He's got a servant, and but all he cares about is getting this money that he stole from somebody else, and he can never get it back.
Wow, what a story. So, now you mentioned another book that you're working on now?
Yeah, I'm writing a book about a person who's probably sociopathic, but he's a Canadian of the middle of the 20th century, who, had he had his way, would have been dictator of Canada, and who's literally been written out of the historical records. So if you were to think of like the Alexander Hamilton plot, where she burns the papers, his wife. This happened to my guy. His wife burned all his papers and then married the guy's best friend, who became Premier of Ontario. And so it's a story of a kid, literally a kid, who works himself, like at 15 he quits school. He walks the back roads selling newspapers. He gets a job on the Globe, Toronto in like 1927. Gets fired for smoking in the office in 1929. Goes to a brokerage firm like 3 or 4 months before the crash. And within a couple of years so he would have been 24. Like 26, he's a millionaire. And he hooks up with these guys who are these prospectors who are kind of like Radisson. They're larger than life, very, very weird guys. One guy is this English guy who loves horses, and he's out prospecting, and he's climbing up a hill, and he pulls this chunk of moss down. There's an 8-foot wide vein of gold with like lumps of gold in it. And this is the guy who backs up my guy, who basically, my guy wants to run the country. He wants to use media power. He buys the Globe, buys the Mail and Empire, puts them together into the Globe and Mail. Then he starts doing radio stuff, and he tries to get rid of party politics in Canada during the Depression, when fascism is on the move. So this is a man using wealth, using media power, trying to develop political power to get rid of what he calls partisanism, which is really democracy. But he's bipolar. So one day he's going to take over the country, and the next day he's hiding under a desk crying. And he has to adapt his life that way. An incredibly successful, gorgeous, physically gorgeous man. Women loved him. He had friends like all over Hollywood, royalty in Europe and stuff. And at the age of 47, he killed himself. And there's a lot more to the story than that. But when he killed himself, they took his picture off the wall. He owned the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Telegram, which were two morning papers. Off came his picture, off came his name. History was written to credit other people founding the original papers. So there's no book about him. His wife burned his own papers. So I have the recordings of the speeches he made, where he tried to whip up a populist partisan sort of leader cult around himself. And I rebuilt all his papers. And I've been doing that for almost 10 years. So what I did was I went into every archive where I could find people that I thought he would have written to or wrote back. So I would get all the letters that he wrote to them and all the letters that they wrote back, because people would keep carbons back then a lot of time. So I've been able to reconstruct his personal papers. And I found he has a daughter who's still alive. And I talked to her, and she's really pissed off at her mother for basically... She and I agree that this man should have a book, and that her mother destroyed the chance for him to be in the historical record.
Wow, that sounds like another fascinating
Yeah,
tale.
so
How close are you with that?
I have 65,000 words written. I have a contract with Biblioasis, so we'll do that book with them, and so it's gonna happen, and it's a really neat story, because not just this guy who's almost Trump-like, but much, much more sophisticated and a lot smarter, and a self-made man as opposed to Trump. And then in the background are all these characters, like these one gold prospector gets murdered and it was never solved. The other guy, he's the richest man in Canada. He's living up in Barrie in a little house that and all he cares about is horses. He's like horse mad, and his house is like full of junk, including all his tax records and stuff. And so the guy I'm writing about goes up and he cleans it all out, organizes everything, and he starts racing horses. And so the money's always there to do whatever, and whatever is to basically get as much political power as possible. At one point, there was an agreement in Ontario to get rid of all the political parties at Queen's Park. And he brokered that agreement. And then the Conservative leader, this is in 1937, the Conservative leader went to Ottawa and talked to the National Conservative leader, who basically held him up by his ankles and shook some brains into his head and said, "You cannot do this. You cannot turn Ontario into a fascist state." And so he had to skulk back and said, "No, we're going to have an election instead." And they had an election.
All right. Well, I'm going to leave it on that note because I want some story to
I'll be
surprise
back.
us. Yes, when you come
back.
back. All right. Terrific. Thank you very, very much for coming and for talking with us.
I had such a good time, and I wish I lived like a lot closer to Windsor. This is such a great town, and the festival people were great. You have such a vibrant literary culture around here. All kinds of local people who are doing... I live in a city of 1 million people. And you live in a city of what?
200,000.
200,000 people. You, Windsor, are doing 10 times what is happening in Ottawa, except for like political writing. But in terms of scholarly writing, poetry, fiction writing, publishing, we have one publisher in Ottawa, and they basically publish. It's really more of a self-publishing thing. You have Biblioasis, which is a real solid publisher, and then all these other publishers that I'm not as familiar with. So I'm not denigrating them. I just don't know them as well, but they're here. And it makes me want to go back to Ottawa and start a publishing company. We have a writers' festival and stuff, but we don't have this incredible community that you have here. And I don't know why. And people say, well, it's Detroit and all that. But I don't think that's it. I don't think that's it at all.
Detroit doesn't hurt, but I don't think that's the genesis of
I
it.
think it's people like Marty Gervais. You just have this constellation of the right people.
Mm-hmm.
So you got Marty Gervais, you've got Dan Wells, who between the two of them are like probably two of the most dynamic publishers in this country, willing to put their own money and take their own risks on projects like Bushrunner, which was turned down by 3 publishing houses, where it would have been. When they look at it now, I'm sure they wish they had taken it, because they didn't see what someone like Dan Wells can see. And, I just wish the whole country was like that.
Oh, that would be lovely.
Yeah, it would.
Well, thank you so much for saying such lovely things about us. We're glad to have you. Come back soon.
No problem.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.